Hey, it's Brandon Laws. Welcome to Transform Your Workplace. Today's episode is brought to you by Xenium HR. Learn more about Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution, custom HR solution, and learning and development programs at xeniumhr.com. All right, in this episode, it features seasoned executive coach and leadership strategist Sarah Schneider, and we're discussing how societal, cultural, and family influences are shaping leadership. Sarah highlights the human side of leadership and stresses that in an increasingly impersonal world, we need to embrace vulnerability and authenticity because it's crucial for our success of not only our businesses, our organizations, but our people. Enjoy today's conversation with Sarah Schneider. Here it is. Sarah, it's a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad we could sync up on this, Brandon.
You're doing some really good work in leadership, specifically around humanizing leaders. And I'm curious, how, and this is a big question. I apologize for starting off the podcast with this question, but how do you think societal, cultural, and even family stuff, the dynamics of that conditioning has impacted the way leaders show up in their professional life?
Yeah, we're just hitting it right out of the gate. I like it.
I had to, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You talk about the conditioning piece, and I think now more than ever, a lot of leaders that I'm talking to, a lot of the stuff I see online, there is more willingness to be like, hey, there's actually a whole human in this role. There's actually a whole human that's doing this job, that's whatever their hours are, whatever their responsibilities are, whatever challenges they're facing at work. It's also happening in their personal lives. It's also happening at home. They have family stuff going on. And maybe that's the optimist in me that's like, oh, it's better. But I do think there is more dialogue now around, hey, can we actually allow people to be more human instead of expecting them to be robots or perfect or whatever in the workplace?
I don't know if you have an example of one of the leaders you worked with where the version of themselves that they see and how they want to show up in the workplace maybe clashed with the conditioned version of the professional setting. I think there's a set of standards that we've always been expected, whether it's inside the company culture or it's just the way we've always done it as far as leadership goes. But the version of the leader they want to be clashed with this workplace setting version. I don't know if you have any examples of that. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I can think of a lot of the leaders I've worked with just because they're, they get on a call with me and they're like, I want to say this thing this way, or I want to start leading my meetings differently, or I want to spend more on my one-on-ones on people's personal goals versus KPIs, right? And not that those two can't be related, but more what's the mentorship available versus what the company wants from us. And, or, I've had leaders be like, I want to have pink hair. And I'm like, okay, well, so it can be even an aesthetic thing, right? What does professional mean in our society? What's the definition of professional we've been taught? And it can also be, what's the definition of leadership that we've heard? And in terms of your question as an example, one that I see often and hear often is that somebody might be more quiet. So we, as a culture, especially in the United States, I know when I was coming up in leadership, the messages that we received is that the person that was the loudest, or the person that talked the most, or the person that had the most to contribute was the most leaderly. And I remember being a 25-year-old, and my boss at the time was very, very quiet, would come in and say one thing, and it was like somebody just dropped a mic, and then she would leave. But she did it with care and brilliance. And that, I see that over and over again, where somebody thinks they have to be louder, and actually it's their quietness that has what they say carry more reverence.
When you're working with some of these leaders, I imagine they come to you for various reasons. How much of this work is in like self-assessment and just self-recognition around the version of them that they want to be versus who they are in the workplace currently?
Yeah. A ton. I think, you use the word self-assessment. I use self-reflection or self-awareness, and they mean the same thing. And I would say that's, 75, 80% is in the inner work. Because if somebody comes to me and they're like, I want to up my leadership game, I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? What's the version of leadership you want to bring forward? They may not be able to answer that right away, or they may answer it in a way that they've learned they're supposed to, like we just talked about. Maybe they want to, I'm supposed to contribute more, or I'm supposed to have more impact, or I should know more about this subject. That might be their automatic answers. But then the self-reflection and the self-awareness is like, well, hang on, what are your values? What's meaningful to you? If you hadn't learned any definition about leadership or professionalism, tell me what you would want it to be, right? That's like where the self-reflection and self-awareness comes in. Otherwise, we just repeat what's modeled to us.
Absolutely. How much of like when you're working with leaders, you're just like asking them questions? Because it sounds like the way in which you're kind of teeing this up is like they need to have a self-assess where they're at. And it sounds like you're just asking them questions and then you're getting them to open up about their tendency. I mean, how else do you learn and help them, right?
Yeah. I'm laughing because a lot of my clients, they'll know that they're going to ask me a question. They're going to be like, well, how do you? And then I'm like, that's a great question. And then I turn the question around so that they not do the work, but they can start coming up with their own wisdom and their own knowledge. Because most people have a knowing or have an inkling already about the question they're asking. And I think part of my job, and even part of a great leader's job, regardless of what level you're at, is to ask open, expansive questions, because it's far more lasting for the person than just giving them the information.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're when you're helping these leaders, you're helping coach them to ask really good questions to bring out the best in their people.
Yeah. I'll have somebody who will be like, hey, that question that you asked me last week, I brought that into a one-on-one. And I'm like, cool, like, nice job putting your coaching hat on, because coaching really is a skill set, and it's a skill set leaders can bring into how they develop people. Even, I was a business systems analyst when I first started out in tech. And I remember I would go into a room with salespeople, ops people, IT people, and try to figure out how I'm going to get everybody on the same page about user requirements. And asking questions was far more powerful, even in a setting like that, than just going in and telling people.
Like, I'm putting you on the spot here totally, but like, what are some of the most powerful like coaching questions that leaders can use to bring out the best in their people?
Yeah. Okay. Let's see.
Dig deep.
Like, let's see, out of my thousands of questions arsenal, which one do I want to bring in? If I put this in the context of like a one-on-one, for example, and let's say you have an employee or team member or even a colleague comes to you and is sharing. Typically, when they share, whatever they're sharing feels like the truth to them in the moment, right? Their beliefs, their perspectives, their experiences, it's going to feel like that is the actual reality. Now, we don't want to make them feel like, their lived experience isn't what they're living. So you have to use care with this question. And you can ask things like, okay, well, what other possibility could that be? What other options are available here? If that wasn't true, hypothetically, if that wasn't true, what would be some other options here, right? That can be a very helpful question. Another one would be something along the lines of like, you hear them, you want to get what they're saying, and then also ask them if you could do it differently. Right? Like, let's say we didn't have the company policies that we have. Let's say that you could express our values a bit differently. Like, let's say all of that, we could put that aside. Like, what would you do? Because that gives them the freedom to respond without the parameters that they're looking through. And then you might have to backpedal into it, right? Okay, well, this is what you would do. This is the resources we have. Where do we find that, meet in the middle?
Some of the best leaders I've ever had have role played with me too. Like, so like they might have a coaching conversation like that. And then it's like, do you want to take a step further and we could role play this scenario if you want it to, especially if the situation hasn't happened yet and you have to have like a difficult conversation or whatever it may be. The role plays could be helpful. I don't know if you ever coach leaders into doing something like that or even role play with them. I think it's pretty powerful though.
It can be, because I think some of what has people to avoid difficult conversations, like you just brought up, is that I know for me, I will play every scenario that could ever happen in a conversation, which you and I both, we've been, doing this long enough to know that like most of those scenarios don't actually happen. So for some people, it's helpful just be like, okay, well, I know that like 90% of those aren't going to happen. So I'm just going to focus on what I can control. Like that would be the ideal reaction. Some of us need a bit more support because conflict really, it activates us just because of our relationship with conflict. So what you just pose of role playing, it allows people to see that, wow, like no matter which direction this conversation takes, I can handle it. And if I can handle it, then I can trust this.
Yeah, it's well said. So when we talk about humanness in the workplace, it's a topic that I love talking about because for me, like I always consider myself pretty emotional, like stable, but I'm an emotional person. I express myself, I'm authentic, and that getting that balance right of authenticity versus like what's professional, because you can't overshare, you can bring too much of yourself, and there is a right balance you have to find. But what is that balance, and how have you determined like the right amount of authenticity, and maybe even define what that means?
How I would come up with the balance is, and this is such a coach thing to say, is I would ask the person what's the intersection or balance for them. I know for me, Brene Brown has the vulnerability hangover concept, and that has been my experience with all the time. Like I'll get off this call and I'll have a vulnerability hangover because I'll be like, oh, I could have said this or I should have said that, or like, I'll just, and even if I didn't share anything all that vulnerable on this call, it's still an act of being visible, which creates vulnerability. So I think to specifically answer your question, it's one, what level of vulnerability am I comfortable with? And for me, that depends on the person, the situation. What impact am I wanting to have? What's the intention of the conversation that I'm in? Like those are some of the litmus tests that I use. And then sometimes I lose my filter and things come out, and then I have to gauge whether I need to clean that up, right? Like, do I need to be like, oh, I might have TMI'd you a little bit there. Like anything I need to do to, clean that up. But I think my personal litmus test and some of the questions I use for people I work with is just like, what are your values? What impact are you trying to have? And what's the intention of the conversation? And that can help inform what they do or do not want to share, what feels real and authentic for them.
Yeah. This is always a tough one because I'm like, as a leader, especially who tends to communicate to employees and outwardly, I do want to show some humanness and vulnerability, but there is like a level of like the right way to do it. So I imagine like let's say a leader of a company gets on stage and business isn't going well, and they say like things are falling apart, the wheels are coming off, like, and maybe they thought that that's vulnerability or whatever, show the human side. But I think what a leader should be saying is like, we've made some poor business decisions that got us to where we're at today, but we're committed. This team is committed to turning things around, and my door is always open to have this conversation. To me, like that level of vulnerability shows like poise and strength, but the humanness aspect versus the other one just seems out of control, and I don't trust that person.
Yeah. Well, and it's, transparency and vulnerability and authenticity doesn't have to be just like a verbal onslaught. Like, and if that's your style and that's the way that you feel the most free and that you don't want to filter and stuff, then you can play with that, right? This isn't about like people putting a filter on themselves. When you are responsible for people, whether you're a middle level manager or a CEO, when you're responsible for people, what you say carries a greater impact. And so the level of transparency or how you are transparent is like, what do you want people to do with the information? Do you want them to hear it and be like, oh, wow, I appreciate that this person, this leader was willing to share that level of detail and behind the scenes with us. And also, now I'm going to go do XYZ. If you want people to run around like chickens with their head cut off, then yes, by all means, freak them out, right? But if you want people to take the transparency and do something actionable with it, then be transparent with some thoughtfulness.
Mm-hmm. Another reason I love your work on just the human aspect of leadership is because this world's becoming less human. I mean, I don't know if you've talked to some of your leaders about like the implications of AI and how the workplaces, like as these tools become more ubiquitous and people are using them and using it in their work, even for communication purposes, how that brings the humanness level down a notch, making humanness all the more important. So I don't know if you're talking about that and if you have thoughts on just the whole concept of like using technology for things that should be human and vice versa.
I work with CTOs. Some of the people I work with are CTOs, and one of them has been navigating the company would like more AI as an option for what they offer their clients. And he is also looking at, okay, well, instead of falling on the AI trend, how do we use it in a way that is most helpful for the work that we do and our clients and our team? So that's the thing that he's navigating. But one of the things that he hears, which you as I think all of us are seeing out in the world, is that AI is going to replace these folks' jobs. And, one of the things he says is like, our goal here at our company is to have it enhance your job, is to have it allow, is it to have it be a support for you. And so I think that's the conversation I love. Like some of the shady stuff I see happening with AI, like, of course, like
by the way, you could train it on your voice too. So there is that.
Yeah. Yeah. And people have asked me, we're like, well, do you put, because I for the past year, I've been putting out a lot more written content, like on LinkedIn and other places and in newsletter. And people have asked me, do you put any of that into Chat GPT? And I'm like, it has taken me my entire life to find my voice. I am not about to have, I have been getting feedback from folks who are more into the AI world. They're like, well, Sarah, you can have it do multiple iterations. But for me personally, what I have been using it for though, and I find interesting, is to take everything I have so much stuff I've written. I've changed my messaging so many times in the last 10 years, and having it parse through that and start giving me like themes. So I think there are use cases both ways, but from the humanist side of it, it's how can we have AI allow for more of our humanity, right? Does it allow people to go home to their families sooner? Right. But that means we have to get out of like, you're at your desk 9 to 5. And if you're right, like, we have to get out of a productivity and we have to see each other all the time to just like, what's the output? And if AI makes our output greater so that we can spend more time with our families, we can take more vacation.
By the way, you can train it on your voice too. So there is that. So I've got an example I'm not going to try to give away all my secrets or show people I'm lazy or anything, but how I'm using it in my work. So like, I'll have this conversation with you. I have a tool that will automatically transcribe this conversation. I could then take that transcript, dump it into AI and have it write me show notes, YouTube summary, a blog post out of it. Those things always took me hours or my team hours to do. So now if you look at it the way we're talking about it, it actually frees you up to have more conversations, human to human. So that's just one example, like how I'm using it to my advantage, where I'm cutting down on the time it takes me to sit behind a computer and write, like do really tedious work. based on a conversation I'm having. I just want to have more conversations. And that's a human thing. So think about it when you're leading or managing people. If you can leverage technology, AI, whatever, to cut down on the tedious, repeatable tasks that it could free you up to spend more time with your team, coaching, one-on-ones, training. To me, that's advantageous.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I hear from the leaders I work with is like, I want to spend more time with my people. I want to spend more time on their development, their mentoring them, their leadership development, and I'm being pulled in all these other directions. So that's a dance that they have to do. And regardless of what level, if you have direct reports, it's a dance that most people have to do, which is how can I contribute and support my team and also do these other things that are expected of me in my role. So yeah, I love what you just pointed to, like allowing people to free them up for the things that matter. And as you were sharing, the thought that also occurs to me is that if people were jerks before and didn't recognize people's humanity, like it's not a technology thing. If somebody can't see the human in front of them, if somebody doesn't have the self-awareness to be like, oh, wow, maybe I should do some work on how I relate to people. If somebody doesn't care about the impact they have on another person, like that's with or without technology.
Right. You, in your work, you have a framework called the ReLead framework. What does like reimagining leadership mean to you?
Yeah. Where ReLead specifically comes from is that for the most part, I think a lot of people have the skills of leadership, especially if they look outside of like the traditional models and they're just like, so I think most people have qualities that make them excellent leaders. And it's about reimagining and re-leading with more awareness, more focus on values, who you want to be in the world, the impact that you want to have. So that's where re-lead comes from. And then the reimagine is a lot of what we've been talking about. Like, what if we didn't hold that there were just a couple of molds that were great for leadership? What if we actually got rid of the idea that there was any model or mold or concept of leadership altogether and just looked at what the individual brings to the table, right? Traditional models of leadership don't account for neurodivergence. It doesn't account for working parents. It doesn't account for people that are more underestimated or underrecognized. And so we're missing out on a whole, just all the vision and possibility and disrupting the status quo that's available to us when we pigeonhole people into that. So that's what I think of when I think of reimagining. It's like, let's just scrap all of it
Yeah.
and have a different conversation about leadership.
In the ReLead framework, what sort of principles or what's inside the framework?
Yeah. Well, one is reveal, which is the awareness piece that you and I talked about in the beginning of this conversation. Reveal, and it doesn't matter what framework I have frameworks around making decisions. Like I think it's the past tech person in me or the project manager. Like my brain works in frameworks and stuff. So I'm always being like, I love alliteration. So I am like, oh, how can I turn this into a framework, and how can I, bring alliteration in? But it doesn't matter what framework I am using. It always starts with some sort of self-reflection, whether it's discovery, whether it's revealing. It's the awareness piece. What informs who we are? What are the beliefs and the thoughts that go through our brain that really just impact everything we do, how we communicate, how we lead, who we are in relationships. That's really the first step. And then from there, we can build on that. Once somebody's aware of those things, then they can start redefining. If we go with the example you and I have been talking about in this conversation, let's say they're feeling very, very stuck in their leadership. Okay, well, let's reveal the beliefs and thoughts you have about leadership. Okay, cool. Now let's redefine it. Let's redefine it in a way that excites you and works for you and that you want to bring into the world. Okay. Now we've got to recalibrate some things, because it's one thing to be like, oh, just go do it. Okay. But then you have to deal with humans and be with their stuff and be with our own fears and thoughts and stuff. So there's a recalibration, which is like, hey, what are the foundations I need to be this leader? Do I need more support? Do I need to be in community with people? Do I need to eat lunch more often, right? Do I need to get away from my desk and not, just finish my food in 5 minutes? So that's where the foundations come in. And then there's the realize piece, which is taking all of this discovery, taking all of this more existential type stuff and putting it into practice, implementing it, if you will.
I imagine like an awareness part of this is understanding the core beliefs that they have, because I think that as leaders, we have these beliefs that have probably stemmed from childhood or other experiences that we have, and they inform the way in which we see the world and some of our decision making. So I don't know if you spend any time on that. I think it's a core piece.
Yeah, that's where I spend a lot of time. So the way I am professionally trained as a coach is ontological coaching. And ontology is the study of being. So a lot of the way that I coach is looking at not just what the person is saying or not just the surface level stuff, but what are the tentacles that interact with everything else? And then there's facilitative coaching, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of coaching, which is just like, what are the 10 things you're going to do? Both of those are important because, again, if we don't have the actions, if we have awareness without action, then it was just a good conversation, right? So it's the both of those things. But yes, there's not a lot of like hills I would put my stake in and be like, this is the thing. But this is one of them, which is if I look at an example of how I am about money, that comes from when I was a kid. I grew up in a lot of financial chaos, and I have very specific thoughts and beliefs about money. If I had not spent the last 10 years examining that with a coach and a therapist and just doing my own work, I would still be acting like I was when I was a kid and, had to deal with some of that stuff. So, and same thing with leadership. What I was taught in school, right? Why aren't you talking more? Why aren't you speaking up more? I would bring that to with my clients now and be like, oh, if I talk as much as possible, then I will have been of value to them, which is it's the opposite of my job. My job is to allow for silence, but I've had to do work on my inner beliefs about silence to be effective. So I'm with you on the looking at our beliefs and how we make decisions and our perspectives is, I cannot think of a more crucial thing for someone to do in this life.
Yeah. So I think I was telling you before we started recording, there's a lot of HR people that listen to this podcast. I started this show as an HR based podcast. And what I always find with HR is that they could play a really foundational role inside of an organization, given the size and the scope of their HR department. But I think they can help leaders bring scale to development and training. And I'm just wondering if you've approached this in some way, if you've ever interacted with HR professionals and helping them adopt a more human-centric approach to their leadership development and helping coach their leaders, or at least pointing them in the right direction. I think HR people have this vantage point where they can be that layer of support. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I'd love to hear what you think.
HR folks, one of their biggest jobs is to make sure that the people are taken care of and supported. And right, whether that's legally, whether that's policies, whether that's, just making time for folks, right? There's that. And they also have executive teams and company directives to manage, right? So they're, in my experience, having been in HR for a very short stint before I left tech, I spent 1 year. I got tired of being on the tech side of things, and I just knew I loved human dynamics. I knew I loved the leadership side of stuff, and so I moved over to HR as an HR business partner for about a year, and was actually responsible for building out leadership development programs for the different organizations. And I have great affection for the line that HR folks dance. And I think one of the things in terms of your question around like the humanist side of things is, one, that they're getting supported on their own, because they have to deal with a lot of people's stuff. They have to hold people's humanity and be with that. And that can take such a toll on them.
Oh, the compassion fatigue is crazy. I imagine like a lot of my colleagues who help their clients and their employees through the pandemic with like, we didn't know what the hell was going on. They came home and they bring all the emotional stuff with them. It's like hard to turn it off. And I just have so much empathy and respect for the HR professional who deals with that.
Exactly, that compassion fatigue, the being with other people's humanity. So that's the first thing that I recommend for anybody who's really having to hold the space for other people, which is like, how can you connect with your own humanity? Do you have people you can talk to? How do you make sure that you are very sourced and fueled up? Because if our well-being is not cared for, it becomes that much harder to be with their stuff. So that's the first thing I would say, is just make sure that they're getting sourced and nourished and allowing for their own humanity, because then we can be with other people's in a greater capacity. Oh, wow, this person is really pissed off about this thing. I don't love how they're delivering that message to me, but how can I listen for or look for or bear witness to this thing? So that's a way to hold humanness. And then in terms of, you also pose the, like, in terms of leadership development creation, I look back on how I created programs and it was just like, this is the role and this is the thing, instead of, hey, here's an overarching thing that this role might require, but what is the person in that seat actually going to need? Where can we create nuance for these folks?
Yeah, that's spot on. So I think like when making the transformation in terms of leadership, there's always going to be some sort of resistance along the way, whether it's internal, external. How do you overcome that?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure you see it all the time with your leaders.
There's this thing that I notice happens, which is, I'm moving into this new thing. And in this case, we're talking about leadership, right? Maybe you're an individual contributor and you're moving into a management leadership role. Maybe you're middle level manager moving into a director role, all right, or director into C-suite, right? It doesn't matter, but you're moving into this new thing. And it's change. Change is challenging for most of us. I've changed things a million times in my life, and I still have a part of me that's like, what about this can I control? Like change is confronting to us, and when we're confronted, some of our limiting beliefs and conditioning gets louder. So one, I would say, let's just normalize it. Let's just say that when you're transitioning into a leadership role, you're going to be confronted. Congratulations, right? Like, welcome to the next edge of your humanity. And what are the skills and tools and things I already bring to the table? I'm a big fan of skills inventory. How can I go through everything I've ever learned, all the way? If you worked in a pizza restaurant, like when you were 20, cool. What's everything you've ever learned, and how is that helpful for the thing you've just moved into? And then what's the thing that you want to grow into, right? What's the leadership development range that you want to add, and have those be, whether it's on post-it notes or in a Google Doc or in a fancier system, but what are the skills that you already have that you do well that support this leadership role, and where is the range that you want to add to it? And that, like, it takes some of the, it demystifies the discomfort of it.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, I really enjoyed this conversation. It was a really fun conversation. It went fast. Do you have any parting thoughts, or feel free to point people to any of your work that you're wanting to share with people?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the ReLead framework, and there's actually a link on my website, and I think you're going to put that in the show notes. But it details the framework a bit that someone could even apply to themselves, right? They could walk through it a bit and be like, okay, what here could I reveal? What here could I redefine, recalibrate? So that can be helpful for folks just as a model to apply for themselves at home with a notebook or an iPad or whatever you like to use. So that's a great thing. And then LinkedIn, I love connecting with folks. I love getting a hey, hi. I like having conversations with folks. So you can also find me LinkedIn Sarah Schneider coach, because there are hundreds of Sarah Schneiders in the world. I have to add I have to add little details to everything. Those are two places I would point people.
My guest today has been Sarah Schneider. Sarah, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brandon. This was fun.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.